I spent my career trying to save species from extinction, and I must admit that I must have occasionally entertained the fantasy of wouldn't it really be neat if one of the species that slipped away could be given a second chance. Let's face it, for 3.8 billion years of life on this planet, no species that's gone extinct has ever come back. And of course, when the movie Jurassic Park came out and everyone's fantasies started to run wild, the world was essentially introduced to this idea that maybe modern biotechnology could actually pull this off. That if the folks in the white coats in the lab actually do pull it off, they're going to have to hand it over to somebody like me who's very good at recovering small populations and building them up to sustainable levels. So one of the species that I sort of cut my eye teeth on was the Mauritius kestrel from the island of Mauritius, the former home of the dodo. And when I started working on the kestrel, it was down to 5 individuals. There are over 900 of them now. But there's virtually no genetic diversity in the population. We've already looked at museum specimens from the 19th century and have found hundreds of alleles that are not present in the population today. So I got invited to be in on the ground floor of the discussions about de-extinction, to some extent representing, you might say, the conservation conscience for the group, which was dominated by overly optimistic, I would say hubristic biotech crowd. Basically, you could ask a couple of questions. Why would you want to do this? Obviously, it's a big challenge, and for people who like to overcome big challenges, there's that sort of, by gosh, if we can, we'll do it. But for many people, a de-extinction, bringing back an extinct species, the only real compelling reason that you can offer for it is, let's face it, it's utterly cool to think that you could bring back a woolly mammoth or a passenger pigeon. But for other people who've perhaps thought a little more deeply about the possibilities, they would argue that it's a matter of justice. For many of the species that have gone extinct over the last several hundred, actually go back thousands of years, we have been the cause of their extinction. So to some extent, you might say that by bringing back some of these species, we're righting a past wrong. Other people think, well, like me, well, this might be interesting to be a sort of a tool of last resort for species that have gone extinct. But on the other side of the equation, a lot of people have brought up why we shouldn't go there, why this probably isn't a good idea. Obviously, it's very unnatural. This has never happened before. We are really sort of intervening technologically in something that's very unprecedented. And many people would also say that there's an ethical component to it. It might indeed be unethical for us to do this, especially in some circumstances. Others who don't think it's a good idea point out that this is clearly going to reduce the urgency to protect species from extinction. If you can simply save a bit of DNA or other genetic material and bring the species back later, why inconvenience ourselves trying to prevent the extinction of the species? So the passenger pigeon has been one of the holy grails of the de-extinction crowd, and those of us who are somewhat skeptical of the prospects of doing this have decided that if you were able to pull it off, which is a real long shot, a lot more complicated steps than give me the genome and I can produce an organism, we decided that it wouldn't be a passenger pigeon, it would be a franken-dove. But still, conservation biologists are kind of intrigued because we think, well, if you pick the species properly and you do it basically with you might say, the health of the ecosystem and the integrity of a community in mind, rather than just what can we get the most publicity for, there obviously would be some benefits to bringing back some recently extinct species. But for the time being, conservation biologists have their hands full saving the tens of thousands of species that are threatened with extinction.
You spoke about selecting species as candidates for either de-extinction or for genetic preservation based on science rather than on sentiment. What are some of those criteria that we would use then to make that selection?
An organization called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It's an international group, and one of the roles that they play is to sort of do white papers, do policy papers that lay out for sovereign nations some of the principles, if you will, of how to undertake conservation. And right now, as we speak, they have a large committee that was formed this summer to write a white paper on the use of biotechnology for de-extinction and genetic engineering of endangered species. They are very much in favor of shallow de-extinctions. Because it produces essentially a copy of the extinct species. They are not so impressed with the idea of a deep de-extinction.
We have conservationists who have very limited resources and who are really trying to work with lots of different species that really need assistance. Where is the money from this technology coming from? And the other part of it is then who owns the species at the end?
You know, the issue of what are the regulations that might apply, the policies and regulations. And some of the policy wonks from our national government say, right now, this slips so cleanly through the cracks in our regulatory system that there is essentially nothing that regulates this activity. A resurrected species wouldn't even come close to the definition of an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. But the prospect, of course, always exists now, and we've had the legal precedent and policy decisions that if you create something genetically novel, you can patent it. And in the case of deep de-extinctions, since you would be creating a completely novel form of life, you could patent it, and it could, you know, if you wanted to produce Pleistocene Park and show your woolly mammoths, you would have the corner on the market. The money that's supporting this is at least something that we apparently don't have to worry about too much. It's coming from a community of donors, private donors. It's not being supported by public funding. It's coming from private donors who really aren't that interested in conservation. They're interested in the biotech and the gee whiz, and we want to be part of doing something that's so unprecedented. And I'm going to end here with, I thought, a particularly appropriate quote from one of my dear childhood mentors, Rachel Carson. "The human race is challenged more than ever before to demonstrate our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves."
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Stan Temple.